Fence Post.
Good afternoon, Grain Valley, and welcome to another edition of the Fence Post. My name is Jason Fenstermaker, my co-host over there, Matt Nevels. And we have a very special guest again. Matter of fact, our first guest is back, Marty Napier. Marty, how's it going?
It's going well today.
So, those of you that don't know, Marty has a title, and she told it to me earlier and I already forgot it. So, I'm just going to say Special Curator of the Fine Goods of Grain Valley.
I think that's what it is. I think that's what she said.
That's a lot more than what I said.
That would be great, though, on a business card. Special Curator of Fine Goods of Grain Valley.
Of Fine Goods, okay.
Marty isn't the president of the Historical Society, but kind of is the curator of the Fine Goods of Grain Valley.
That's
See?
pretty good.
It's one of those titles you don't have to ask what you do, right? You might have to ask how fine are the goods.
Right.
But
you get the title, you know what.
You know exactly. So we wanted to bring Marty on again. I know we had a good response the first time we had you on about just kind of the city of Grain Valley. And these last couple episodes have focused on downtown. Last week we had Teresa Ozenbaugh on, who's the Deputy City Administrator, who's also the President of the Downtown Committee. I know I'm on the Downtown Committee. I know you're on the Downtown Committee.
Sorry, Matt.
Matt has heard the Downtown Committee since. And so I kind of want to just get a historical perspective of the downtown area. I know what we have now, and I know what we're trying to get to. But to go to the Historical Society and see some of those pictures of what old Grain Valley looked like in the downtown area is just amazing. Just first, I want you to put us back in the earliest establishment of Grain Valley. I know there was other two towns, but when Grain Valley first started, around what years and where were we?
Well, Grain Valley was signed over by a man named Lucas out of Illinois, and it was actually done by proxy and signed by Mr. Cannon. And probably a lot of people are familiar with the Cannon Edition on the south side of the railroad.
I would say they're more familiar with Cannon Street.
Well, Cannon Street, okay. But anyway, the original downtown was 4.1 acres, and it extended from Main Street east 1 block to Cypress. A lot of you probably think of Cypress Street as being one of the alleys behind Main Street, but there actually is a Cypress Street over there. And it went north and south. It went from Walnut south to 3rd Street. It's kind of interesting. 3rd Street is still called 3rd Street in Grain Valley, although we have no other numbered streets. Do you know why?
Because we can't count.
No, because it was at one time the state required it. The state of Missouri required it.
Required to have a 3rd street or
Well,
a numbered street?
Numbered streets. And so Grain Valley went to 3rd Street, which, if you know Grain Valley, it's just south of the car wash. So it was very small, but amazingly, the first building was not in town. Maybe to avoid high taxes back then, because Mr. Cannon built his store, the original store in Grain Valley, on the southwest side, right next to the railroad tracks. And you may or may not know that the train stopped in Grain Valley, and the reason it came through Grain Valley and not Stony Point and Pink Hill was because it went next to Sniovar Creek. They were steam trains, and so they stopped for water. And the closest to the creek is just, you can walk down the railroad tracks, I don't know, a couple of football fields and hit water from Sny Creek. And so there was a water, I don't think they called them towers then, but if you watch many westerns, you know what the old water reservoirs, I guess, look like.
Yeah, Matt was there.
Yeah.
Matt was there.
That's right.
That's right, you were there, man. But anyway,
You guys hung out by not the water cooler, the water reservoir.
for some reason, when they were putting water on the train, on the steam locomotive, everybody had to get off the train. And so Mr. Cannon very smartly built a little store so that they would have a place to go to and get some food or something to, a snack, maybe some candy, or I don't know what food was like back then, but and a bottle of soda pop or water or whatever was the popular.
I believe it was sarsaparilla.
It could have been.
Back then,
That's probably right. So actually, the first building is kind of like a lot of downtown Grand Valley, it's kind of a vacant lot now, or the area just south of the railroad. And then also built in 1878 was the first depot in Grand Valley. And if you drive through Grand Valley now and you look to the east on the south side of the railroad, you'll see a grain bin down there, and that's about where the depot was.
Nice.
And then also on that side there was a garage, but I'm not sure. I think it probably was just right there by the railroad. So those were the first buildings first structures that we know about.
And this is around what time?
That was in 1878 when the town began.
Okay. So it started on kind of that side of things. Obviously, we now know our downtown to be kind of on the north side of
the railroad
tracks. Mm-hmm. All the pictures we have are of kind of this downtown area on the north side. So when did it kind of shift and maneuver to not obviously what we see today, but at least the position of what we see today?
Well, right away, because as I said, Mr. Cannon did not build his store in what was the city limits. And so everything was on the east side of Main Street. And it just kind of came up Main. I know I'm old, but I can't really tell you what was here in the early 1900s exactly, except from the pictures. And we have a picture like of a millinery shop, but I don't know where it was. And we have a picture of the old telephone office, but I'm not sure where it was. And we tried, I've had magnifying glasses, I've blown them up on my computer screen, and the wording, you just can't 100% read it. Can't make it out.
Have you reached out to the FBI and all them to help enhance things? Yeah, I mean, they haven't got anything going on.
Go there. You could go there. They don't have anything else to do.
So I find it, obviously I'm a history buff. I love trivia. I love history stuff. And, I love looking at some of those old pictures. And obviously, the downtown has expanded. The buildings are newer. Most of the buildings, when they first started were pretty much all wood. Mm-hmm. And so obviously, we've had a few fires, or at least some fire down here.
A few.
Yeah.
Well, we've had two, actually. One Christmas Day, 1931, my grandfather's feed store burned. And the other one was December 9th of 1959, when my father's hardware store burned. So my family's really been affected by fire.
And that next year, the Napier started a fire brigade.
No, but 2 weeks later, the town of Grand Valley did pass a bill to have city water.
And so, just kind of go off topic with those fires, was it only their buildings to burn, or did more catch on?
Well, let me go back just a little bit. When Grand Valley started on that side, there was, I'm going to kind of go to the 1930s or 40s, really, and tell you what I do know about. Just south of the railroad tracks, there was a lumber yard, and there was, in the 30s and 40s, and 50s, and probably into the 60s, Mr. France had a gas station there. And the last gas station he had was a Conoco station, but I remember at one time it was, what is it that has the red horse? Texaco? The flying red horse.
Yeah, Pegasus.
I could sing the song, but you don't want to hear it.
Yeah.
And then coming across the railroad tracks, the first building there was built in 1900, and that was the hardware store. And it was right next to the railroad tracks because my mom and dad always thought the store might burn, but they figured it would be sparks from a locomotive or something that would catch
So close.
the building on fire, because literally you could just kind of shimmy between the hardware store and the railroad tracks.
Now we know the oldest building in Grand Valley is the church. Well, it used to be the church. Well,
The
it's
Methodist church,
Methodist
and
church.
now
Then it
it's
was
a
a quaint. Then it
Baptist.
was a quaint gathering, and
Right.
now it's the Baptist church. But the oldest one, kind of right here on our downtown strip, is the bank.
The bank, and
And
that was built in 1905.
And at one point, we had. It's really hard. 2 banks just in downtown.
Right. Well, we had the Bank of Grand Valley, and then next, coming up the street going north, next to that was a building that was built by the Williams family. And there was, I think he built it originally as a garage. That's what his granddaughter told me. But when in the 40s, the building next to the bank was a drugstore. And it remained a drugstore up into the 1960s. When the Storms family owned it, they actually sold medicine, but I don't think pharmacists necessarily had to have a degree. And so by the time I came
Some would
along,
say the good old days.
Yeah.
Not everybody.
they sold bottled tonics and salves and things like that.
Put some salve on it.
So anyway, the bank that was next, and then the next building going north was where the post office was, and it was just a very small little cubby in the front of the building. And most of the time, the rest of that building, which is where the pottery is today, that was a restaurant, and it was owned by Mrs. Greer and Mrs. Michael owned it for a while, several different people, but it was quite a big restaurant in town, and it was open on Sunday for fried chicken and so forth.
Nice.
Oh, wow.
Then the next building where the Historical Society was
that the only restaurant in Grand Valley at
there
the
were
time?
3 restaurants in Grand Valley,
Gosh.
believe it or not, in the early 50s. The next building where the Historical Society is today was, for years, it was a grocery store. It was owned by Mr. Frost. It was owned by my uncle, Clyde Fristow. The Pogues ran it for a while. The last owner was a man named Wayne Minner. Then, of course, we had the alley, and then your building that we're sitting in was built by Mr. O'Connell in 1921.
Irish O'Connell's Ale, named
Yeah,
after
John O'Connell.
John O'Connell,
John T.
who
O'Connell.
built this building.
That's
You
exactly
didn't know that?
right.
I did not know that.
Yeah.
And I believe this building today is I know it burned, and it was rebuilt as the brick building that we have today in 1921, but I believe it's on the original foundation.
Yeah.
Because if you anyway, I believe that it's there.
That's neat. That's cool.
Yeah, it is. And then next to you, where the pharmacy is today, that was a locker plant. And of course, a locker plant in the 20s, the 30s, the 40s, that was a big deal because a lot of people didn't have a refrigerator. They had a true ice box.
Yep.
And a horse and buggy or a horse and an ice truck took ice and delivered it around town. You got a 25 or 50 pound block of ice and put it in your ice box. And that was sold there. And then in the back, there were meat lockers. And I can remember when I was very young, going with my grandmother, had a locker. And that's where they kept, like if they'd get a quarter or half a side of beef, they would have it packaged and keep it at the locker plant.
Which actually, if you look at down below at Iron Kettle, there's a wall with a beam above it that used to be a passway to get from this general store to the locker plant.
Yeah.
And when they tore down the locker plant, eventually they had to brick in that. So when you actually look on the north side of my lower building, you can see the nice brick. Then you can see where they crammed it in there to fill it, where they just patched the hole.
Patch up the hole. And then next to the locker plant was a beautiful 2-story bank building. It was the Snibar Bank, and it was built in the teens, about 1915, I think.
Did you have to work at Snibar to bank there?
No. It just had the name Snibar.
And what people understand is there was a lot of people that worked for Snibar too.
Oh, yeah. Well, there were 17 houses on the farms. So, and the houses were all occupied by people that worked on the farms. So, yeah, it was big. Snibar Bank closed in 1926. It closed slightly before every bank practically in America closed, but
What happened?
it was financial.
Something happened around that time?
Was there some big event?
Some great kind of event that took place?
I don't know.
Do
I
some
don't
research.
know.
Do some more research.
I do know that this is kind of I do know that over at the Historical Society, we have papers where the Green Valley School District had their school bonds from the building that was torn down in 2004, but was built in 1926. And they had gotten their bonds through the bank just before it closed. And so there was a lawsuit, and I don't know what happened because we just have a few papers. But it was, by that time, the original owner of the bank, which was one of my great uncles, it was D.C. Harrington, and he died in 1926. So they were suing his widow, and I don't know what happened to that. And then beyond that, there was a house, and then a green space, and the Christian church was on the corner of Walnut in Maine. Across the street, there was another house, and that was the Williams home. And Ed Williams came here in 1910, or he was here by 1910, and he had a brick factory. Believe it or not, there was a little brick factory in Green Valley, and it was down kind of where the community gardens are right now. Okay. And according to everything you read, the brick for the 2 buildings just south of here were made in that brick factory. He built the Williams garage from bricks made in his own brick factory.
So the bank and the building we're in were prior to that, but then the other brick buildings right here probably came from that.
From those bricks.
Yeah, nice.
And several other buildings in downtown Green Valley. The old Royal Playhouse, which is also a parking lot now, was probably built from bricks coming from the brickyard. Mr. Williams also had a slaughtering house, and I read a newspaper article. We have a copy of it at the Historical Society. One year he slaughtered over 600 cows and hogs, and I don't know if there were any sheep in there or not, but I know for sure there was swine and beef cattle that were killed in the slaughterhouse. So it made sense that the blue building that's now on Main Street, I think it's an old car place, but that was Williams Grocery Store and Meat Market. And if you visit the Historical Society, I've got a whole collection that was given to me by Mr. Williams.
Not if. When you visit the Historical Society, 506 Main Street.
Yes. Look at the notebook that I assembled from 1931 to about 34. His granddaughter gave me a collection of all of the newspaper ads.
Oh, wow.
And we kind of had to guess when they were, because I'm finding that even today, people are real good about advertising something, and they'll put weekend special, May 1st, 2nd, and 3rd, but they never put the year.
Oh. What year?
And so you kind of sometimes, but I did find something that had the
Today
year
we assume
anniversary.
now,
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. And
But
so
future.
it's really hard to tell.
Yeah.
But anyway, on that side of the street, the blue building was a grocery store up through the 1960s. The last owner, who was there about 25 years, was Roland France. And at the beginning, I talked about France's oil or filling station. Well, Ray France, that owned that, was Rollins father.
Oh, okay.
So, little nepotism there, I guess. I mean, and then the buildings next to that, it's funny. Everyone that comes in that's from Grand Valley say, well, what was over there? And we all are kind of vague about what might have been there. I do know that the building on the corner at Front Street, which is now the tattoo parlor,
OG Tattoo,
in the
Anthony.
early 50s, along the side facing Front Street, they had a whole rack of canoes because Tarzan Lakes, I think I mentioned this last time I was here, was a real resort for people from Kansas City. And they would come
I
down.
remember people telling me, like, maybe they're like, there used to be a marina. You could buy boats and stuff like that.
Right there.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And you thought,
Like crazy. Well, I used to think for the longest time, like, okay, this is the first little space outside. They're heading down to the Ozarks. What? No.
No, they were going to
They're going to Tarzan
Lake
Lakes.
Tarzan.
oh, yeah.
Yeah.
And I can tell you, in the early 50s, the boat dock, there was you could get gas there for your boat. And there was a little restaurant there. And
On Tarzan Lakes.
Sunday, right
You
on
were
the
saying on Tarzan Lakes,
Yes.
there was a boat dock and a restaurant.
Yes. And on Sunday, for $1.50, you could get the best all-you-can-eat chicken dinner around. And we would leave church and hurry out there and try to not be at the end of the line because a lot of people...
How big were these boats? Because Tarzan Lakes, I mean, it's a
Well,
lake.
just-
There's a couple lakes,
yeah.
but it's.
Not real. I mean, they weren't obviously 90-mile-an-hour speedboats, but
Did they even have a motor?
yes, they
had
were
motors.
motorboats. They sold gasoline and they had motorboats. And you didn't go very fast, but
Now, at this point, one thing we talked about earlier, off air that I really like is the idea that Grain Valley had, you said, three hotels downtown. Now, when people think of a hotel, don't think of a Holiday Inn with, 112 rooms.
So it's not like the Westin.
no.
No,
Not
well,
quite.
do
Not
you
quite.
remember any of the names of the hotels?
Well, no.
Okay. It was just called Hotel.
Well, it might have been the Grain Valley Hotel,
Beer.
or it might have been the name of the person that
Blower.
owned it. The building, like I said, the hardware store burned, and the fire started in the building just north of the hardware, which was a two-story brick building. And there was a little walk between the buildings that went back, 25, 50 feet, and then you went upstairs, and that's where the rooms were. And when it burned, and all during the 50s, it was rented. They kind of put some rooms together, and there were either 2 or 3 apartments up there. But they had to be very small because, well, look at this building. Most of the buildings downtown are 20 feet wide.
Yeah, pretty much
So-
all of them are 20 by 80 is pretty much the downtown.
Pretty much the
area.
downtown, and that's what that was. So by the time they had the walkway in front, the hotel room couldn't have been more than maybe 16 feet deep and I don't know, 80. So you take 80 and divide it by 6, and you've got, 15-foot rooms or whatever. So they weren't real big, but I know there were apartments up there because that's where the fire started. Was in one of the apartments. A man was smoking in bed, fell asleep, and the fire started, and there was no water, so they just about think they had the fire out, and they run out of water. And on the personal side, when the fire was over, for many years, I can tell you where the list was. My mother wrote 37 thank you notes to the fire departments and the water haulers that tried to save the hardware store. And they were, I remember specifically, it was as far south as Pleasant Hill, and there's a fire truck here from Higginsville,
Oh, wow.
and Odessa, and Buckner, and everybody around had water at Big Green Valley. And amazingly enough, the store burned on a Friday night, and not the following Tuesday, but the Tuesday after that, which was 10 days later, they had another bill to get water in Green Valley, and there were only 3 no votes. And it was the 17th time that they had voted to try to get water. And every time it was defeated, until the night that the hardware store burned, almost every building in town had a roof fire. And, it was a warm night and windy, and even there were 2 houses down on Front Street that had little fires that they were able to put out. But
that was finally what did it for
that did it. That did it.
We need
So.
Well, sometimes you gotta have tragedy, and then like a phoenix, you grow from it. So this pretty much puts us in the 1950s, somewhere around there, right? And on a future episode, we'll kind of talk about from the 60s to the present and the future with Marty.
We'll continue to have like Marty minutes on.
I think it's yeah. And then one day we don't have to be here. Marty just does it.
No. That will not happen, I can promise you.
Well, Marty, as always, we appreciate you coming on, sharing your knowledge, just kind of the history of the downtown area. I can't emphasize enough, please go to the Historical Society, walk in, see. They're open every Wednesday from
10 to 3.
10 to 3.
The fence post.